Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the motion before the House today reads that given that the Trans Mountain Expansion project is in the national interest, will create jobs and provide provinces with access to global markets, the House call on the Prime Minister to prioritize the construction of the federally approved Trans Mountain Expansion project by taking immediate action, using all tools available to establish certainty for the project and to mitigate damage from the current interprovincial trade dispute, and table his plan in the House no later than noon on Thursday, February 15th, 2018. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach on this debate since my colleague from Beaches East York is in here. And I want to try and change his mind today. I think that we're not having an honest debate in this House. To be honest with you, I think where the debate really needs to be is, do we want these projects approved or not? And my concern with the federal government's approach as an Albertan MP has been, there's been a lot of obstacles put in the way without a lot of action. And what does that mean? It means I think what the Liberals would like to see is they would like to put up as many obstacles as possible, saying that they're going to approve these projects and get them built, while not actually having the political will to build them out and hoping that they'll fail down the road. I just don't think that's honest. No. I think if the Liberals do not want these projects built out, as I know some of their caucus do not, then just be honest about it, because then we can move on from there. What is exceptionally bad for the Canadian economy writ large is for the Liberals to pretend to industry that Canada is somehow open for business for our revenue projects, our natural resource projects, and then change the rules for assessment midstream, change the playing field. Just be honest. Is that going to cost them some votes? Sure. Is it going to keep them some seats? Sure. But we need to move on from this point here. So the reason why I want to see this motion supported is if that plan that we're asking them to table is we don't have a plan and we don't want this to proceed, then just be honest so we can move forward from there. Because I've got a lot of people in my riding, in my province, and frankly across the country that need some certainty on this. You know, I watched this play out with the Energy East debate, which of course, you know, was at a different stage of approval. But TransCanada said, you know what? This is a multi-billion-dollar project, a multi-billion-dollar decision, and the investment climate is just not here for that project. One of my colleagues just asked about refining products. Well, how can we refine products if we can't take them out to where the refineries are? That's what Energy East was supposed to do, but it fell off the table. And, you know, there was an article in the National Post that I really resonated with, and it was Canada doesn't need a new energy regulator, it just needs a spine. And I really think that that spine has to go one way or the other. Are we an energy producing nation or aren't we? Earlier today, the Minister of Natural Resources tried to frame out this question by saying, we do not share the views of those who would simply pump as much oil as we can as fast as we can, nor do we agree with those who say that we should leave all the oil on the ground and never build a single pipeline. But where are they? They haven't actually defined where they are on that scale. And to me, by trying to have it both ways, they're on the latter camp. And here's where the problem is at that. We already are taking these resources out of the ground. And the problem is that we're not getting the biggest value add for them because there's a price differential because we're confined to one market versus if we can get that product out to Tidewater. So, you know, the minister's statement there was contradictory in and of itself. I don't understand why they can't table a plan by Thursday. If they're seriously committed to this, that how they're going to see this built through should be something that they've been thinking about for a long time. The minister also said this morning, we're working in good faith without an artificial deadline. But here's the reality. The funders of this project, the people that actually want to build this out, the producers of the product, they're not working on an artificial deadline. They're working on a real deadline. And that's, does this investment still make sense, given the political instability in the country? There is no artificial deadline when you're talking about billions of dollars of investment. So his statement there was so ignorant of the understanding of how business works. And that's why I just would like him to be honest, so that we can start talking about the ramifications of not having the political will to build out a project that has passed every single review project in this country. My colleague asked, from Beaches East Yard, he asked about climate change and what we would do. I'm going to push back on his government's approach. They have been firmly attached to their $40 a megaton price on carbon. And he said that's the most efficient way of doing things. Yet I have not seen his government once stand up and say how much emissions that will actually reduce Canada's greenhouse gas profile by. They haven't said it once. In fact, when I've been following this, you know, I've got a slight background in economics, and you know, one of the leading economists who's always out on this issue says, I don't think we should actually care too much about what the specific effect on emissions will be. And he starts talking about, now I can see where the Liberals are transitioning to, that it's just about putting a price on pollution. But if he really cares about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then yeah, the policy instrument should count. And this is where we need to have a mix of regs, strong regs that encourage the adoption of technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We probably should be talking about this in terms of trade mechanisms, but we have to do that in the context of understanding that we can't price ourselves out of competitiveness with our major trade partners, because that inherently affects jobs and wealth and government revenues and all these good things that we want to do for social programs in the country. So for the government and the Prime Minister to say, okay, well, we need to transition to a non-carbon-based economy, there is a transition period. And this is not it. This is not adequately managing that. Trying to have it both ways, sucking and blowing, if you will, on approval of pipelines, hoping that industry will just pull out, is not responsible government at all. It's a lack of a plan. And that's why they should be able to table a plan in the House of Commons by Thursday. And even if it's simple as, we don't want this built, then take accountability for that decision. There are groups in this country that will never be reasoned with, that you can somehow have environmental sustainability and economic growth. They do not want this pipeline built. It doesn't matter what regulatory body says that. They do not want this built. What will the government do in that situation to people who look at, even if it went through all of this new crazy process that they put in place, which I could talk about right here, these people will still say we don't want this built. So then what is the government managing to? Are they managing to their opinions and their votes, or are they managing to what's in the long-term best interest for the economy of this country? And that's why this motion is important, and that's why it should be supported. If the Prime Minister is, as the Natural Resources Minister used to argue his rationale for not voting for this, going to say that pipeline is going to get built, then how? What is the government going to do? There is a trade war breaking out between two of the economic powerhouses of this country right now. And what's the Prime Minister's response been? I'm going for a jog in California. That's not enough. And if the Prime Minister does not want this project built, then he just should say it. I'm sure, I can't even imagine what his caucus meetings look like on Wednesday morning. I'm sure he's got the member from the area in Burnaby. I'm sure he's got people who have large constituencies of people who just don't want these pipelines built saying, we shouldn't build this out. Why are we even entertaining this? Then be honest to that constituency, go with them, and let everybody else who feels elsewise hold the government to account for that decision. But this is not responsible. And their climate change plan is not going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the most efficient way. If you can't even talk about price elasticity in the context of the Canadian economy, in a regionalized Canadian economy, we're not at a good place right here. So there should be a plan. You know, the other thing is that really disappoints me is that, you know, this comes down to, well, the Harper government, this and that. Yes, the Harper government was unabashedly pro-pipeline, because we took that political will and said this is in the best interest of the country and this is where we're going. You know, we could have a whole argument or not around the electoral consequences for that. The reality is that we are reaping 20 years of environmental NGOs putting forward a very strong message in Canada, but the reality is the government now has a responsibility, now that they've been elected, to say, look, this sector creates a lot of jobs, a lot of revenue for every provincial government and the federal government in Canada. We can't just remove that without there being some economic consequence, right? So letting these projects just kind of die, it's not just about this pipeline, it's about sending a message to the entire international community about whether or not Canada is open for business writ large. Because what they're saying is governments, respond very poorly to these types of decisions. People just want political certainty. I think that this pipeline can be built out. It's already passed all the regulatory process, Mr. Speaker. I think this can be done in an environmentally responsible way. This is Canada. I would just like the Prime Minister to stand up and say the same thing, but with how attached, and what he's going to do to push back when the provincial governments stand up and become obstructionist against the people in my riding and every single person in this country that sees economic growth and benefit from the sustainable development of our natural resources. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I listened intently with my honourable colleague's speech. And I'll repeat what the Minister said earlier today. I have a hard time understanding why the official opposition can't take yes for an answer. And I was heartened to hear a number of the things that certainly I and the Minister and the Prime Minister have been saying in this House over the past number of days and weeks. That yes, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, expansion pipeline, is supported by this government because it will create good-paying jobs, because it's good for our economy. And I wonder if the member opposite could tell us why, when she talks about all the tools in the toolbox, she suggests a sledgehammer is the right approach. Thank you.
For Calgary Nose Hill.
Last time I checked, you actually do need a sledgehammer to build pipelines. This government needs to exert political will to get this built. I said it in my speech. There are groups that will never, ever politically support the build-out of a pipeline. The government must realize that by now. There are groups that are just fundamentally opposed to seeing this through. And, my colleague, who
won't even wait for the answer.
Won't even wait for the answer. It's her responsibility, having a government appointment, to speak up and not hide behind delayed regulatory process. She needs to understand that this is not going to get built without the government, the Prime Minister saying, the Prime Minister should have said this last week. This is something of national import. I'm going to look at every constitutional tool to get this done. I stand behind my decision, and we will not allow the provinces to use interprovincial trade as a barrier, especially when we're trying to negotiate with the United States on NAFTA.
Hear, hear.
That's leadership. And hiding behind false equivalencies is not leadership.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Repentigny.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma collègue, tantôt, a commencé son discours assez surprenant en disant qu'elle voulait avoir un débat clair et honnête. Je suis d'accord. Cependant, quand on vient me dire que le pétrole des sables bitumineux est un pétrole propre, je ne suis pas sûre que ce soit honnête. Quand on nous dit, par exemple, que le pétrole, on prend du pétrole de l'Arabie saoudite, là non plus, ce n'est pas très honnête. Et quand on dit que par train, c'est plus sécuritaire, eh bien, le département américain a étudié les déversements de 2002 à 2012, déversements par pipeline ou par train, et il en conclut que ce n'est pas plus sécuritaire. Ça, ce sont des faits, des études qui sont là. Le gouvernement fédéral, qu'il soit conservateur ou libéral, il arrive aux provinces, il arrive au Québec avec ses gros sabots en décidant pour eux et en passant par-dessus ces gouvernements-là qui veulent protéger leur population. Comment peut-on justifier ce fait-là?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
So what my colleague said was, I don't believe this is safe. Well, that's like saying, I believe in the tooth fairy. This is why we have quantitative evaluative processes to determine whether or not a project is safe. This project has gone through inordinate amounts of environmental assessments to determine that very question by scientists. And what she's just said is, I'm going to politicize this by coming up with a bunch of stuff that isn't backed up by fact, when we should be looking at the outcome of a review process that took months and used scientific efforts. I don't accept her politicization and fear-mongering on this topic.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Alberta for her great speech. And, we've heard from two ministers, Secretary of State to the Minister, about Trans Mountain expansion. Is good for Canada. It's in Canada's interest. But yet we look here just in the recent past, the Liberals rejected Northern Gateway Pipeline project, which would have been moved Canadian oil to the Pacific Ocean. They put an oil ban on it. Then the Liberals dragged their heels and forced TransCanada to cancel the Energy East pipeline, which would have let Canadian plants in New Brunswick refine Canadian oils. A whole bunch of extra regulations. To the member, do you think that there's an ulterior idea here? You're saying about dishonesty by the government. It just seems to be a way of dragging their heels and hoping that this thing cancels.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
You know, this morning the minister started his speech by saying, "The purpose of this debate is to fan regional tensions and open historical grievances." That's pretty telling. That was the first thing out of the Natural Resources Minister's mouth this morning, was a political statement like that. You know, instead of looking at one of these projects as a way to build prosperity across this country, he put that little nugget out there. Wouldn't the Liberals love that? You know, when I was in cabinet, the thing our former Prime Minister always did was look at the regional balances and projects, and I feel like this government's doing the opposite. The only reason that that is an issue right now is because of the statement that comes out of the Prime Minister's mouth and the Natural Resources Minister's mouth. And I'm sure that all Canadians who understand that a united Canada is greater than the sum of its parts will hold him to account, especially in Winnipeg, for those ignorant and divisive comments.